The reading of my grandfather's will was supposed to happen on a Thursday morning in February, in the office of an estate attorney named Gerald Marsh on the third floor of a building in downtown Memphis. I know the date because I had it written in my calendar for 2 weeks. I know the floor because I had been there once before, years earlier, when my grandfather had updated some documents and had asked me to drive him. I know the attorney's name because I had spoken to Gerald Marsh on the phone 4 days before the scheduled reading, confirming my attendance. What I did not know, what I had no way of knowing, was that by the time I arrived at Gerald Marsh's office on that Thursday morning, the will my grandfather had spent the last years of his life carefully preparing had already been removed from the attorney's file, altered, and replaced with a version that cut me out of everything. And the person who had done it was my brother. And what my brother had not known, what saved me and ultimately destroyed him, was that my grandfather had left one additional page. A page my brother never found. A page that changed everything. I need you to stay with me, because the story has layers, and the layers matter. And what is underneath all of them is something I think a lot of people in this community will recognize. So welcome to the Revenge Diaries. If you are new here, subscribe and hit that like button before we go any further. These stories are real, and they are told with the honesty they deserve. Drop a comment and tell me where you are watching from. I love knowing where this community reaches. And now let me take you back to the beginning. My grandfather, Walter Eugene Hollis, was 81 years old when he died on a Wednesday in January. He died at home, in the bedroom of the house he had lived in for 43 years, in a neighborhood in Memphis that had changed around him while he stayed exactly where he was, which was entirely consistent with who he was as a man. He had been a machinist for 30 years, then a small landlord. He owned 4 rental properties in addition to his home, and he had built what he had with the specific patience of someone who understood that solid things take time. He was not a demonstrative man. He did not say I love you easily or often. He showed it the way men of his generation often showed it, by showing up, by remembering things you had told him months ago, by fixing things that were broken without being asked, by leaving behind something that meant you would be okay after he was gone. He had 2 grandchildren. Me, Thomas Hollis, 34, a high school history teacher in Memphis, and my brother Derek, 38, who worked in real estate and had always had a smoother relationship with money than with people. Derek and I had been close as children in the uncomplicated way of boys who grow up in the same house and share the same grandparents and the same summer memories. As adults, we had drifted into something more careful, not hostile, not cold exactly, but with the specific distance of 2 people who have understood that they want different things from the world and have agreed, without saying so, to respect that distance. My grandfather loved us both. I believe that completely. That he and I had something specific, a rhythm of conversation, a shared interest in history and in how things were made, a habit of Saturday mornings at his kitchen table that had continued well into my adulthood. I drove over most Saturdays. I brought coffee from the place he liked on Summer Avenue. He talked, I listened and talked back. And in the last 2 years of his life, as his health declined and the conversations became quieter and more deliberate, he said things to me that I understood were the things he needed to say before he could not say them anymore. He told me once, about 8 months before he died, that he had worked hard to make sure things were fair. He said, I don't want either of you fighting over when I leave. I've been careful, Thomas. I've been very careful. I told him I trusted him. He said, I know you do. That's why I'm telling you. At the time, I did not fully understand what he meant by careful. I understood it later, much later, in Gerald Marsh's office on a Thursday morning in February. Derek had always been aware of what our grandfather owned. He was in real estate. He thought in terms of property values, assessed worth, the mechanics of what things translate to when you put a number on them. He knew about the rental properties. He had at various points over the years offered to help manage them, to help our grandfather find better tenants, to handle things that our grandfather had always preferred to handle himself. Our grandfather had thanked him each time and declined. Not because he did not trust Derek, because he was a man who managed his own affairs and did not want assistance that came with an opinion attached. I found out later through a combination of what Gerald Marsh told me and what I eventually pieced together. From phone records, my grandfather's neighbor shared with me that Derek had been to Gerald Marsh's office twice in the month before our grandfather died, not as a family representative, not with permission. He had gone in, identified himself as a family member assisting an elderly relative with document organization, and had been given brief access to the file on 2 separate occasions by an administrative assistant who was new and who had not verified his authorization. On the second visit, something had been removed and something had been put in its place. Gerald Marsh did not discover this until the morning of the reading. He called me that morning, about 40 minutes before I arrived, but I did not answer because I was driving. I walked into Gerald Marsh's office at 9:45. Derek was already there, sitting in one of the chairs with his jacket on and his hands folded, and an expression I can only describe now, looking back, as staged composure. The kind of stillness that is worked at rather than natural. Gerald Marsh was at his desk, and his face when I came in was the face of a man managing something difficult. He stood when I entered and he said, "Thomas, thank you for coming. I need to speak with both of you about something before we begin." He looked at Derek when he said it. Derek did not change expression. Gerald Marsh explained that during his review of the file that morning, he had found an inconsistency in the document. He was careful with his language, deliberately careful. The language of a man who understood he was in the middle of something that might become legal very quickly. He said the well on file did not match the characteristics of the document he had last reviewed and initialed. The paper was different. The formatting had minor variations. And one page, the final distribution page, the page that specified exactly what went to whom, appeared to have been substituted. The original page was gone. What was in its place allocated the 4 rental properties and the primary residence entirely to Derek, with a nominal cash amount designated for me. Gerald Marsh said he had attempted to reach me before I arrived because he wanted me to know before we were in the room together. He had a copy of the document as he had last reviewed it in his own secured records, a practice he maintained as standard procedure, and the 2 versions did not match. I looked at Derek. Derek said, very calmly, "I don't know what you're talking about," and something in the calmness of it, the specific, practiced calmness of a man who had rehearsed this moment, told me everything. I needed to know about what had happened and about how long it had been planned. I want to stop here for a moment, because this is the place in the story where I think most people, sitting across from what I was sitting across from, would feel a specific combination of rage and vertigo that makes clear thinking nearly impossible, and I felt both of those things. I want to be honest about that. I felt them sitting in that chair with Gerald Marsh's desk between us and my brother, 3 feet to my left, with his folded hands and his staged composure. But underneath the rage and the vertigo, there was something else, something that had been placed there, I understood later, by my grandfather. Something that would not become clear for another 48 hours, but that I could feel even then, like a weight in my pocket that I had not yet opened. Because my grandfather had told me he had been careful, and I had not understood what he meant. But sitting in that office, I began to understand that my grandfather, a man who had spent 30 years machining precise components, and 40 years managing properties, and 81 years paying very close attention to how people behaved when they thought they were unobserved, had been careful in a way that went beyond what anyone in that room yet knew. What would you have done in that moment? Sitting across from your brother, knowing what he had done, with a lawyer in between you and the rest of your life, hanging on what happened next? I want to genuinely know. Drop it in the comments right now before I keep going, because I have asked this question to people in person, and the answers are some of the most interesting things I have ever heard. Would you have confronted him immediately? Would you have walked out? Would you have stayed quiet and started thinking? Because what I chose to do is what I want to tell you about next. And it came from a place I did not entirely expect. I stayed quiet. I looked at Derek for a moment, and then I looked at Gerald Marsh and I said, "What are the next steps from a legal standpoint?" Gerald Marsh said he was obligated to report the discrepancy and that the estate could not be distributed until the matter was resolved. He said I should retain an attorney. He said the matter might involve law enforcement depending on how the investigation proceeded. I nodded. I thanked him. I stood up. Derek stood up at the same moment and said, "Thomas," and I said, without turning around fully, "Not right now, Derek," and I walked out. I sat in my car in the parking garage for about 20 minutes. I called my friend Paulette, who had been my closest friend since college and who had the specific quality of knowing when to talk and when to simply be on the phone. She was on the line with me for the whole 20 minutes without saying much. At some point, she said, "What do you need?" And I said, "I need to go to Grandpa's house." She said, "I'll meet you there." The house on Birchwood Avenue was exactly as my grandfather had left it. His neighbor, a woman named Mrs. Ellison, who had known him for 20 years and who had been with him in his final weeks, had kept it aired and maintained in the way of someone who understood that a house needs tending after a person leaves it. I had a key. I had always had a key. I let myself in and stood in the hallway and breathed the specific air of that house, old wood and coffee, and the particular stillness of a place that has held a life for a long time and is now holding its absence. I went to his study, not to look for anything specific. I did not yet know what I was looking for. I went because the study was where my grandfather had always kept the things that mattered to him, and because being in that room felt like the closest I could get to asking him directly what I was supposed to do next. His desk was orderly in the way his whole life had been orderly. His files were labeled in his handwriting. His reading glasses were on the blotter, folded, as if he had set them down and planned to come back. Paulette arrived while I was sitting at his desk. She came in quietly and stood in the doorway and looked at me and said, "Find anything?" I said, "I'm not sure what I'm looking for." She sat down in the chair across from the desk, the chair I had always sat in on Saturday mornings, and she said, "Your grandfather told you he'd been careful. What does careful mean for a man like Walter Hollis?" And I looked at her. And then I looked at the desk. And I opened the center drawer. There was an envelope, plain white sealed, with my name on the front in my grandfather's handwriting. Not Derek's name, mine. And underneath the envelope, paper clipped to a copy of the original will that matched the version Gerald Marsh had described the version. That had been replaced was a single additional page, a page that was not part of the formal will. A page that was, instead, a notarized letter dated 6 weeks before my grandfather died, witnessed by Mrs. Ellison and by Gerald Marsh himself, who had apparently made a separate visit to the house for exactly this purpose. And that page described, in my grandfather's specific and precise language, the existence of a separate account, a trust account established through a different institution entirely, not referenced in the will, not accessible through the estate, designated solely for me, containing a sum that represented the liquid equivalent of the rental property values, which he had been quietly converting and depositing over the course of 3 years. My grandfather had known. Not that Derek would do exactly what he did, I do not think he knew that specifically. But he had known that the visible assets, the properties, and the house were the things that created conflict, and that the safest gift he could give me was one that did not exist in the same room as the thing that might be fought over. He had restructured his estate quietly and privately so that what went to me was already mine before he died, held in an account that required nothing from the will to access, that was not subject to the estate process, and that could not be touched by anything Derek had done or planned to do. He had been careful. He had been very careful. I sat at his desk with that page in my hands, and I thought about Saturday mornings. I thought about the coffee from Summer Avenue and the kitchen table and the deliberate, unhurried way he had said the things he needed to say in the last 2 years. And I understood that this page, this account, this quiet restructuring done over 3 patient years was the thing he had been telling me about, not in those words, but in the only words that mattered. "I've been careful, Thomas. I've been very careful." I called the financial institution the following morning. The account was exactly as described. The access process was straightforward. The notarized letter was one of the required documents, along with my identification and a death certificate. The funds were released to me within 10 business days. I retained an attorney named Helen Park, who had been recommended by a colleague and who, when I laid the full situation on her desk, looked at everything with the focused attention of someone who was simultaneously building a case and cataloging evidence. She said, "Your brother committed document fraud. That is a serious matter regardless of how the estate resolves." I said, "I know. I wanted to handle it correctly." She said, "Then let's start with everything you have." The investigation that followed was handled primarily through Gerald Marsh's firm, which had its own obligation to report the document substitution, and through Helen's filings on my behalf. Derek retained an attorney of his own. There were weeks of back and forth, of formal correspondence, of the specific and exhausting procedural machinery of a legal matter that involves both civil and potential criminal elements. Derek's attorney initially attempted to frame the document discrepancy as an administrative error, a miscommunication, a filing mistake, something that could be explained without implicating Derek directly. Helen took that argument apart methodically because Gerald Marsh's administrative records were clear about who had accessed the file and when, and because the new administrative assistant, when formally interviewed, described Derek's visits in detail that was specific and credible and entirely inconsistent with innocent intent. The outcome took about 5 months to reach fully. Derek did not face criminal charges. The prosecutor's office, after reviewing the evidence, determined that the specific intent element required for the most serious charge was difficult to establish beyond reasonable doubt given the administrative access situation, and offered instead a civil resolution path that Derek's attorneys strongly encouraged him to accept. What the civil resolution meant in practical terms was this: Derek received nothing from our grandfather's estate. The properties in the house were sold, and the proceeds were distributed according to the original will, with a version that had been in Gerald Marsh's secured records, all along which split the estate evenly between us. Derek also paid Helen's legal fees as part of the settlement, and he was required to complete a formal statement acknowledging his unauthorized access to the estate documents, which became part of the permanent record of the proceeding. I want to tell you about the conversation I had with Derek after it was over, because I promised you honesty, and the honest version of this story does not end with a clean line between villain and hero. It ends the way most family stories end, with something more complicated and satisfaction and more lasting than anger. He called me 3 days after the settlement was finalized. I answered because I had decided I would if he called. He said, "I want to explain." I said, "Okay." And he said, "I thought he was going to leave it all to you. I thought the years he spent over there on Saturdays meant he was going to leave you everything, and I was going to get nothing." And I was so sure of it that he stopped. I waited. He said, "I was wrong about what he intended, and I was wrong about what I did. And I don't expect you to forgive that. But I needed you to know that it came from fear, not greed. Fear." I sat with that for a long moment. I thought about my grandfather's kitchen table. I thought about the page in the desk drawer. I thought about the fact that my grandfather had split the estate evenly, had always intended to split it evenly, and that Derek had convinced himself otherwise based on nothing more than the story fear told him. And I said, "Grandpa left us the same amount, Derek. He always planned to." The silence that followed was the longest silence I have heard on a phone line in my life. And then Derek said quietly, "I didn't know that." And I said, "I know you didn't. We are not close now. I want to be honest about that. What happened between us cannot be walked back to where we were before, and I'm not sure I would want to, even if it could be, because the before was already a careful distance, and what happened revealed things about that distance that I cannot unknow. But we are not enemies. We spoke at Christmas briefly at our parents' house. He looked tired in a way that had not been there before. I think the weight of what he had done and what it had cost him, not just financially, but in the way he had to see himself afterward, is a consequence that did not require anyone to engineer. It arrived on its own, as those things do, and it settled in the way that permanent things settle. Mrs. Ellison called me about a month after everything was resolved. She said she wanted me to know something. She said that on one of the last good days my grandfather had, he had sat with her on the back porch in the afternoon sun, and he had talked about me. He had said, "Thomas is going to be okay." I made sure of it. He had said it the way you say something when you are not worried about it anymore, with the settled confidence of a man who has done what he set out to do and is at peace with the result. Mrs. Ellison said, "I thought you should hear that." And I thanked her, and I meant it with every part of me. I think about my grandfather differently now than I did before all of this. I knew he was careful. I knew he was deliberate. I knew he loved in the specific action-based way of his generation, but I did not fully understand until I found that page in the center drawer of his desk, the depth of the attention he paid to the people he loved. He had watched his family for 81 years. He had understood each of us, the history teacher who came on Saturdays and the real estate agent who offered to help manage things. He had not judged either of us. He had simply paid attention, and he had arranged things quietly and over years so that what he left behind would land where he intended it to land, regardless of what anyone tried to do to redirect it. That is the thing about a truly careful person. They do not just prepare for the best outcome, they prepare for the worst one. They build redundancy into the system the way an engineer builds redundancy into a bridge, not because they expect failure, but because they understand that solid things account for the possibility. My grandfather was a machinist. He understood tolerances. He understood the difference between something that worked under ideal conditions and something that worked under the conditions that actually existed. He built me something that worked under the conditions that actually existed. And that, more than anything else, is the gift I carry. Here's what I want to leave you with. If there is someone in your life right now who pays quiet attention, who shows up consistently, who remembers things, who does not make grand gestures but makes real ones. I want you to see that person clearly, because the people who love carefully are the ones who protect you in ways you will not understand until you need the protection. Tell them you see it. Tell them while you still can. Because my grandfather told me he had been careful, and I heard the words, but I did not fully understand the weight of them until I was sitting alone in his study with a piece of paper in my hands that he had put there knowing I would find it. And I would give anything to sit at that kitchen table one more Saturday morning and tell him that I understood, that I had always been grateful, that the coffee from Summer Avenue and the unhurried conversations and the patient, specific love of a man who did not say the words, but built the proof of them, that all of it landed, that none of it was wasted, that I knew. If this story gave you something, a feeling, a memory, a shift in how you are thinking about someone in your life, please share this video. Drop a comment below and tell me what you would have done in that attorney's office. Tell me what you would have done when you found that envelope. I genuinely want to know. Subscribe to the Revenge Diaries if you are not already here. And like this video if it gave you something worth keeping. I will see you in the next one.